The coffee cup slipped from my fingers, shattering against the linoleum floor as Mr. Henderson's voice boomed through the thin apartment wall. "Linda, your damn sprinklers are flooding my tomatoes again." I grabbed a dish towel, kneeling among the ceramic shards. 68 years old and still cleaning up messes that weren't entirely my fault. The automatic sprinkler system I'd installed last month had one loose joint that sent water cascading over the property line every third day. I'd tried explaining the repair schedule to my neighbor, but patience wasn't Marcus Henderson's strong suit. The phone rang. I ignored it, focused on sopping up the spreading coffee puddle. The answering machine would catch it. But the ringing persisted, cutting through Marcus's continued shouting from next door, something about property values and inconsiderate tenants. On the fifth ring, I stood up, tossing the soaked towel into the sink. Linda Patterson speaking. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Robert Morrison from Morrison & Associates in Scottsdale." The man's voice carried that careful professional tone I'd learned to recognize over the years, the kind that preceded bad news. "I'm calling regarding Brian Michael Lawson." My hand tightened around the receiver. Nobody had called Brian by his full name in my presence for 15 years. "What about him?" "Ma'am, I'm very sorry to inform you that Mr. Lawson passed away on Tuesday evening. The funeral service is scheduled for this Friday at 2 o'clock at Desert Rose Memorial Chapel." The words hit like a physical blow. I sank into the kitchen chair, its familiar creak suddenly too loud in the silence that followed. Tuesday evening. That was 3 days ago. 3 days while I'd been worrying about sprinkler systems and coffee stains. "Mrs. Patterson, are you there?" "Yes. I'm here." My voice sounded strange, distant. "How did you get my number?" "Your name was listed in Mr. Lawson's personal effects as an emergency contact. I understand you were previously married." "Previously married. 22 years reduced to a legal footnote." "Yes. We divorced in 2010. The words came automatically, muscle memory from various forms and applications over the years. "I see. Well, there will be a reading of the will following the service. You're named as a beneficiary, so your presence would be appreciated." Beneficiary? The word felt foreign, impossible. Brian had built his empire after our divorce, transforming the small consulting business he'd started during our marriage into something I barely recognized from the newspaper articles. What could he possibly have left me? "Mrs. Patterson, will you be attending?" Through the kitchen window, I could see Marcus Henderson examining his waterlogged tomatoes, hands on his hips in that stance that meant another confrontation was brewing. But his complaints seemed to come from another world now, muffled and insignificant. "The chapel," I said slowly. "Which one did you say?" "Desert Rose Memorial on Camelback Road. The service begins at 2, followed by a brief reception. The will reading is scheduled for 4:30 in our offices downtown." I found myself nodding, though he couldn't see me. "I'll be there." After hanging up, I remained in the chair, staring at the phone as if it might ring again and deliver different news. The coffee stains on the floor had already begun to set, dark rings that would need scrubbing. But I couldn't move. Couldn't process the simple fact that Brian, vibrant, stubborn, impossible Brian, was gone. The afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories I'd tried so hard to forget. As I sat there, the name Brian Michael Lawson echoed in my mind, each syllable pulling me backward through time until I was standing in Charlie's Diner on a snowy February evening in 1987, watching a man in a navy blue coat argue with the manager about his hiring practices. "You're telling me you won't consider male applicants for weekend manager because men can't handle customer service?" His voice carried across the nearly empty restaurant, clear and uncompromising. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've heard all week." I'd stopped mid-bite of my apple pie, fork suspended halfway to my mouth. The man had turned slightly, and I could see his profile, sharp cheekbones, determined jaw, dark hair that caught the fluorescent light. He was magnificent in his anger, and I found myself hoping the manager would keep arguing just so I could listen to him tear the logic apart. "Sir, I didn't mean any offense. Of course you didn't mean offense. You just meant to discriminate. He pulled a business card from his wallet, sliding it across the counter. When you change your mind about hiring based on qualifications rather than outdated assumptions, call me. The door chimes jingled as he left, and the diner felt smaller somehow, drained of electricity. I watched through the window as he climbed into a blue Honda Civic, noting how he checked his mirrors twice before pulling into traffic. Careful, methodical, but not afraid to fight for what was right. That one's trouble, the manager muttered loud enough for the whole place to hear. I stood up, leaving a $5 bill next to my half-eaten pie. No, I said, surprising myself with my certainty. That one's extraordinary. The business card lay abandoned on the counter. Brian Lawson, business consultant. I memorized the phone number before stepping into the February wind. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to call. When I finally did, he answered on the second ring with a brisk, Brian Lawson. This is Linda Patterson. We haven't met, but I saw you at Charlie's Diner on Friday night. A pause. The woman with the apple pie who defended my honor to the manager. You heard that. I was getting my gloves from the car. You left a good tip too. I could hear the smile in his voice. So, Linda Patterson, what can I do for you? Have dinner with me somewhere better than Charlie's? Another pause. Longer this time. Are you asking me on a date, or do you need business consulting? Definitely a date. Though if you have any advice about convincing handsome men to have dinner with strangers, I could use the consultation. He laughed, a real laugh, not the polite sound men sometimes made when women tried to be charming. Saturday night. Antonio's on 3rd Street. 7 o'clock. He wore the same navy coat to dinner, but underneath was a crisp white shirt that made my pulse race. We talked for 3 hours about everything except business. His childhood in California, my job at the utility company, our shared love of old movies and newer books. When he laughed at my story about accidentally flooding my apartment while trying to fix a leaky faucet, I knew I was falling. 6 months later, I proposed in that same diner, sliding a ring across the same counter where he'd left his business card. Marry me, Brian Lawson. Make me the luckiest woman in Arizona. He said yes before I'd finished asking. Our wedding day blazed with September sunshine, the kind of perfect weather that makes promises feel possible. Brian wore his grandfather's suit, altered to fit his slimmer frame, and carried wildflowers we'd picked that morning. My hands shook as I slipped the ring onto his finger. Forever, he whispered, and I believed him completely. Jennifer arrived 2 years later, a squalling, red-faced miracle who transformed our quiet house into something alive with purpose. I remember standing in the hospital room, watching Brian cradle our daughter with the same fierce determination he brought to everything else, and thinking that this perfect moment, was all I'd ever need. But even then, holding that perfect baby, I noticed how Brian's eyes occasionally drifted to the business magazine someone had left on the nightstand. As Jennifer grew from toddler to schoolgirl, I began to notice things I'd missed in those first blissful years. When she turned 7, Brian bought her a computer. Not a toy, but a real machine worth more than my monthly salary. She needs to understand technology, he explained, watching her navigate programs I'd never heard of. The future belongs to kids who think digitally. I'd suggested teaching her to paint instead. He'd laughed, but not kindly. We'd moved by then to Paradise Valley, a house with 3 bathrooms and a kitchen island bigger than our old apartment. Brian's consulting firm had landed a contract with a tech consortium, and suddenly we had money for things I'd never imagined needing. A housekeeper came twice a week. Our refrigerator dispensed ice through the door. Jennifer's bedroom looked like a toy store. Isn't this wonderful? Brian asked one evening, gesturing at our new dining room with its crystal chandelier and table that seated 12. We can finally entertain properly. I missed our old kitchen table, scarred from years of Jennifer's coloring projects and our late-night conversations. This new table reflected light like a mirror, showing every fingerprint, demanding coasters and placemats. The entertaining started almost immediately. business associates, potential clients, other successful couples whose conversations revolved around market share and investment strategies. I'd wear my best dress and try to contribute, but discussions about hedge funds and corporate restructuring left me feeling like I was speaking a foreign language badly. Linda works at the utility company, Brian would explain when someone asked, and I heard something new in his voice. Not pride, but an apologetic edge, as if my job required an excuse. Jennifer thrived in this new world. At 10, she could discuss computer programming with Brian's tech-savvy clients. At 12, she was critiquing the wine choices at restaurants I couldn't afford on my own. At 14, she rolled her eyes when I suggested family camping trips, preferring Brian's business conferences in Denver and Salt Lake City. "Mom doesn't understand," became her favorite phrase, usually delivered with the exasperated sigh of someone far too sophisticated for mundane concerns. The first real fight came on Jennifer's 15th birthday. Brian had planned a party that looked more like a corporate networking event. Catered food, hired entertainment, guest list full of business contacts and their children. I'd wanted something simpler, maybe a barbecue in our backyard with her school friends. "This is embarrassing," I told him the night before, watching servers arrange elaborate flower arrangements. "She's 15, not 50. She's growing up in a different world than we did, Linda." He adjusted a centerpiece with the same precision he brought to contract negotiations. "These connections matter. These relationships will shape her future. What about just being a kid?" He turned to face me fully, and for a moment I saw something cold in his eyes, calculation where there used to be warmth. "Being just a kid is a luxury we can't afford to give her. The world is competitive. Either we prepare her to win, or we prepare her to lose." I thought about my own 15th birthday, fishing with my mother, a homemade cake, presents wrapped in newspaper comics. It had been perfect in its simplicity. The party was a success by Brian's standards. Jennifer charmed the adults, networked with their children, received gifts that spoke of serious money. Laptop computers, designer clothes, a mountain bike worth more than some cars. But I caught her once, standing alone by the pool, looking lost among all the sophisticated celebration. "You okay, honey?" I asked. She straightened quickly, slipping back into the persona Brian had helped her craft. Of course. Why wouldn't I be? But for just a moment, I'd seen the confused little girl underneath all that premature sophistication, and it broke my heart. That party marked the beginning of the end, though I didn't recognize it then. What followed were 10 years of slow-motion disaster, like watching a landslide from the bottom of the mountain. Inevitable, destructive, and impossible to stop. Brian's business consumed more of his time, more of his attention, more of his soul. Weekend family dinners became conference calls. Vacation plans got cancelled for client emergencies. Jennifer's school events competed with board meetings, and the meetings always won. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," he'd say when I complained about missing another of Jennifer's volleyball games. "This business supports our lifestyle. Someone has to make the hard choices." But I understood pressure, the kind that came from keeping a power grid running, from making sure thousands of people had electricity when they flipped their switches. The difference was my pressure served something larger than myself. By the time Jennifer graduated high school, she'd become a stranger to me. Brian had groomed her into his perfect protégé. Sharp, ambitious, dismissive of anything that didn't advance her prospects. When I suggested she consider trade school along with college applications, she looked at me like I'd suggested she become a medieval serf. "Mom, that's exactly the kind of thinking that's holding you back," she said, 17 years old and already talking like a business consultant. "You settled for mediocrity. I won't make that mistake." The words hit like physical blows. Settled for mediocrity. As if 25 years of keeping the lights on for our community meant nothing. As if being a steady, present mother was somehow shameful. College made everything worse. Jennifer chose business school, Brian's alma mater, naturally, and came home for holidays full of theories about market dynamics and personal optimization. She looked at our house, our life, our values with barely concealed contempt. You could do more, Mom, she'd say, as if my contentment was a personal failing. Dad started with nothing and built an empire. You've had the same job for 20 years. Some things matter more than money, I'd reply, but she'd already stopped listening. The final explosion came during her senior year. Brian had been working 100-hour weeks on some massive acquisition deal. I'd been handling everything at home, grocery shopping, laundry, the mundane tasks that kept life running. When he missed Jennifer's graduation because of a client crisis, I finally said what had been building for years. This is enough, Brian. Family has to come first sometimes. He stood in our kitchen, that crystal and granite shrine to success, still wearing his business suit at midnight, checking emails on his phone. Don't you dare lecture me about priorities. Everything we have, everything Jennifer's accomplished, exists because of my work. What about everything we've lost? Like what? He finally looked up from his phone, genuinely puzzled. Like us. Like being a family instead of a corporation. He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw my answer in his eyes before he spoke. We weren't a family anymore. We were a business arrangement that had outlived its usefulness. Maybe it's time we stopped pretending this is working, he said quietly. The divorce took 6 months. Brian's lawyers were efficient, professional, devastating. I got the house on Maple Street, our old starter home that he'd kept as rental property, and enough money to live modestly. He got everything else, including Jennifer's unquestioned loyalty. You're holding her back too, Jennifer told me during one of our last conversations before she moved to Scottsdale to work for Brian's company. All this guilt about family values and simple living. It's toxic, Mom. I can't be around that negativity anymore. I sat alone in my empty house afterward, surrounded by boxes of memories from a life that apparently meant nothing to the people I'd loved most. Now, 15 years later, the afternoon light was fading outside my apartment window. My coffee had grown cold. The ceramic shards still scattered on the floor. Somewhere across town, funeral preparations were underway for the man who'd once promised me forever, and I had no idea why he'd remembered my name in his will. The 3 days between Robert Morrison's call and the funeral passed in a strange, suspended state. I'd cleaned my apartment twice, pressed my one good suit, and rehearsed conversations that would never happen. Each morning I'd considered not going, but each evening found me still committed to paying my respects, whatever the cost. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, typical May weather in Arizona, unseasonably cool. I stood before my bathroom mirror, adjusting a scarf I hadn't worn in 5 years, wondering what Brian would think of the woman I'd become. The reflection showed someone older than I felt inside, silver hair where brown used to be, lines mapping the geography of quiet disappointments. The drive to Desert Rose Memorial Chapel took 20 minutes through neighborhoods that told the story of Phoenix's economic divide. My modest apartment complex gave way to middle-class subdivisions, then to the manicured lawns and stone facades where Brian's circle lived. The chapel sat on a hill overlooking the valley, its modern architecture suggesting permanence and prosperity. Cars lined the circular drive, Mercedes sedans, BMW SUVs, a handful of Teslas that probably cost more than I'd made in my best year. I parked my 15-year-old Honda between a Lexus and a Cadillac, feeling like an intruder at someone else's celebration. The chapel's interior whispered money, polished concrete floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, flowers arranged with artistic precision. At least 200 people filled the space, their conversations creating a low hum of respectful mourning mixed with business networking. I recognized some faces from the business dinners Brian had dragged me to during our married years, but most were strangers from the life he'd built after me. I slipped into a back row, hoping to remain invisible until the service ended. But whispers followed my arrival like ripples in still water. A woman in an expensive black suit nudged her companion, pointing discreetly in my direction. I caught fragments of conversation. Her ex-wife. Can you believe she, after what she put him through? The stories had taken on their own life over the years. Apparently, in this version, I was the villain who'd held back a brilliant man, the anchor that had nearly drowned his ambitions. I'd learned long ago not to fight narratives that served other people's need for simple explanations. Mom. The voice cut through the chapel's murmur like a blade. I looked up to see Jennifer striding down the aisle, her face a mask of disbelief and barely controlled anger. At 37, she'd inherited Brian's sharp features and commanding presence, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Success radiated from her like heat from pavement, expensive watch, perfect haircut, the confident posture of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. What are you doing here? Her voice carried across the chapel, turning heads and silencing conversations. I stood slowly, meeting her gaze. I came to pay my respects. You lost the right to do that 15 years ago. She moved closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something sophisticated and aggressive. He wouldn't want you here. Maybe not. But I needed to be here. For what? To ease your conscience? To play the grieving ex-wife for people who know exactly what kind of wife you were. The chapel had gone completely quiet now. 200 pairs of eyes focused on our confrontation like spectators at a sporting event. I felt the familiar weight of judgment, the same pressure that had suffocated me during those final years of our marriage. But this time something was different. This time I had nothing left to lose. I'm not here to cause trouble, Jennifer. I'll sit in the back. I won't speak to anyone. When the service ends, I'll leave. You'll leave now. Her voice rose another notch, drawing murmurs of approval from the crowd. You embarrassed him enough when he was alive. Don't compound it by pretending to grieve his death. I remained standing, holding her stare. Around us, the chapel buzzed with anticipation. Someone coughed. A cell phone vibrated against wood. Before I could respond, Jennifer turned to address the gathered mourners, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. I apologize for this disruption during what should be a time of remembrance. She gestured toward me with the casual dismissal of someone swatting a fly. My mother seems to have forgotten that divorce means you're no longer family. A few people nodded. Someone whispered agreement. I felt heat rising in my cheeks but forced myself to remain calm. For those who don't know, Jennifer continued, warming to her theme, this is Linda Patterson, the woman who spent 22 years holding back one of the most brilliant men this city has ever produced. While my father was building an empire that employed hundreds of people, she was content to punch a time clock and complain about his ambitions. Jennifer, that's enough. The words came out harder than I intended. Is it? Because I think these people deserve to understand why you're really here. She turned back to the crowd, a prosecutor addressing a jury. She took half his assets in the divorce, despite contributing nothing to his success. Then she spent 15 years acting like the victim while he built something magnificent. The crowd was fully engaged now, a few heads nodding in agreement. I saw faces I recognized, former neighbors, people I'd considered friends during the marriage. None of them met my eyes. He supported her for years while she refused to grow, refused to take risks, refused to be the partner he deserved. And now that he's gone, she shows up expecting sympathy, expecting to be treated like she mattered in his life. Each word landed like a physical blow, not because they were entirely untrue, but because they reduced 22 years of marriage to a simple story of failure and blame. I thought about defending myself, explaining the complexity of what we'd shared, the love that had existed alongside the growing incompatibility. But what was the point? These people had chosen their narrative long ago. My father died building something that will outlast all of us, Jennifer concluded, her voice rising with conviction. He deserved a wife who would have helped him reach those heights, not one who tried to drag him down to her level. The chapel fell silent. I stood there, fully exposed, feeling the weight of 200 judgmental stares. Part of me wanted to walk out, to spare myself the continued humiliation. But another part, the part that had loved Brian Lawson more than anything else in the world, refused to be driven away from his final goodbye. Are you finished? I asked quietly. Jennifer's eyes flashed with surprise. She'd expected me to crumble, to slink away in shame. When I remained standing, her confidence flickered for just a moment. "I loved your father for 40 years, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent chapel. 22 of them as his wife, 18 more as someone who wished him well despite everything that went wrong between us. I'm not here to make claims or demand recognition. I'm here because once upon a time, we made promises to each other that mattered, and I choose to honor that memory." I sat back down, folding my hands in my lap. Around me, the silence stretched uncomfortably. Jennifer stood frozen in the aisle, apparently unprepared for resistance to her public trial. "The service will begin in 5 minutes, someone announced from the front of the chapel, the funeral director, probably, trying to restore order to his carefully orchestrated event. Jennifer shot me one final look of contempt before striding toward the front pew reserved for family. As conversations gradually resumed, I caught fragments of continued gossip. The nerve of some people. Poor Jennifer, having to deal with this. Should have stayed home. But I stayed through the eulogy that painted Brian as a visionary who'd overcome obstacles to achieve greatness. Through the readings from business associates who spoke of his leadership and innovation. Through the musical selections that emphasized triumph over adversity. When it ended, people filed past, offering condolences to Jennifer while pointedly ignoring me. I waited until the chapel had mostly emptied before standing to leave. "Mrs. Patterson?" A woman in an expensive suit approached, middle-aged, professional, carrying a leather briefcase. "Patricia Morrison from Morrison and Associates. Could I have a word?" As the last hymn faded and the funeral director stepped forward with closing remarks, I felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settling over me like a heavy coat. The ordeal was nearly over. In a few minutes, I could slip out through the side door, drive home to my quiet apartment, and try to forget this entire humiliating experience. Around me, people were gathering their things. Purses, programs, the subtle restlessness that signals a formal event's end. Jennifer stood near the front, accepting condolences with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. A few people glanced my way, but most had already dismissed me as irrelevant to the day's proceedings. I was reaching for my purse when a voice stopped me. "Mrs. Patterson?" Patricia Morrison approached with measured steps, her expensive suit impeccable despite the long ceremony. Up close, she looked younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of handling wealthy clients' affairs. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, extending her hand. "Patricia Morrison, Morrison and Associates. We spoke on the phone." "Thank you." I shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. The service was very nice. Brian would have appreciated it. Indeed. He was quite specific about his final arrangements. She paused, glancing around the emptying chapel. "I wonder if I might have a word with you and Jennifer. There are some matters we need to discuss regarding Mr. Lawson's estate." Before I could respond, Jennifer appeared at my shoulder, her expression shifting from practiced grief to alert interest. "Patricia, finally. I was wondering when we'd handle the business side of things." "Of course, Jennifer. These matters require careful attention." Patricia's voice carried the measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering important news. "I'd like both of you to come to my office for the reading of your father's will." "Both of us?" Jennifer's eyebrows rose. "Is that necessary?" "I mean, she's not." She gestured vaguely in my direction. "Your mother is specifically named in the will, Jennifer. Her presence is required by law." I felt a flutter of surprise. Named in the will. That seemed unlikely given everything that had passed between Brian and me. More likely some minor formality, perhaps forgiving an old debt or confirming that I had no claim to his estate. "I don't think that's necessary," I said quietly. "I'm sure it's just a formality. You don't need me there." Patricia's eyes met mine directly. "I'm afraid I do, Mrs. Patterson. Mr. Lawson was very specific about who should be present for the reading. Both you and Jennifer must be there." Something in her tone suggested this wasn't negotiable. Jennifer looked annoyed but shrugged with the casual confidence of someone who knew she had nothing to worry about. Fine. Let's get this over with. She turned to me with barely concealed impatience. Try not to make this more difficult than it needs to be. The walk to Patricia's office took us 3 blocks through downtown Phoenix, past buildings that had watched the city's fortunes rise and fall with the tech industry. Patricia maintained professional small talk, comments about the weather, the turnout at the service, carefully neutral observations that revealed nothing about what awaited us. Her office occupied the top floor of a restored brick building, all dark wood and leather-bound books that spoke of established success. Certificates and diplomas lined the walls, interrupted by photographs of Patricia with various local dignitaries and business leaders. It was exactly the kind of place Brian would have chosen. Prestigious but not ostentatious, successful but respectful of tradition. Please, have a seat. Patricia gestured toward 2 leather chairs positioned in front of her mahogany desk. Jennifer claimed the chair closest to Patricia, leaving me the one slightly to the side, which felt appropriate given my peripheral status in these proceedings. Patricia settled behind her desk and opened a thick file folder, extracting several legal documents with the careful precision of someone who'd performed this ritual countless times. The afternoon light slanted through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the suddenly quiet room. Before we begin, Patricia said, adjusting her glasses, I want to express my condolences again. Brian was not only a valued client but someone I considered a friend. His loss is deeply felt by everyone who knew him. Jennifer nodded solemnly. I remained silent, unsure what response was expected from someone whose relationship with the deceased was so complicated. Patricia lifted the top document, several pages bound with a blue backing, and cleared her throat. This is the last will and testament of Brian Michael Lawson, executed on March 15, 2024, and properly witnessed according to Arizona state law. The will supersedes all previous wills and codicils. Only 14 months ago. I wondered what had prompted Brian to update his will so recently. Had he been sick? Had something happened that made him contemplate mortality? The will confirms that Mr. Lawson was of sound mind and disposing memory when these documents were prepared, and that he was under no undue influence or coercion. Patricia's voice carried the formal cadence of legal proceedings, each word carefully enunciated. Jennifer leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped together. I could see the anticipation in her posture, a woman preparing to claim her inheritance, to finally step fully into the empire her father had built. Patricia turned to the second page of the will, her reading glasses catching the afternoon light as she continued in her measured, professional tone. I hereby make the following specific bequests and devises, she read, her voice steady and clear. To my beloved daughter Jennifer Michelle Lawson, I leave the family home at 847 Paradise Valley Drive, along with all furnishings, artwork, and personal property contained therein. Jennifer smiled, a satisfied expression spreading across her face. The Paradise Valley house was worth at least $800,000, a substantial property with mountain views and enough space to entertain business associates properly. Additionally, Patricia continued, I bequeath to Jennifer the sum of $500,000, to be transferred from my primary investment account within 60 days of probate. $500,000 plus the house. I watched Jennifer's reaction carefully, noting how her smile flickered slightly around the edges. She was pleased, certainly, but I could see her calculating in her head. $500,000 was significant money, but Brian's business empire was worth far more than that. Where was the rest? Where was the company? That's wonderful, of course, Jennifer said, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty she was trying to mask. But what about Dad's business interests? The company. Patricia set down the first page and lifted the second, her expression remaining professionally neutral. I'm continuing with the specific bequests, Jennifer. Please allow me to finish reading the relevant sections. I shifted in my chair, feeling increasingly like an intruder witnessing a private family moment. $500,000 was more money than I'd seen in several lifetimes. Combined with the house, Jennifer was receiving an inheritance that would set her up comfortably for years. It seemed appropriate, natural even. She was Brian's daughter, his chosen successor in life, the person he'd groomed to understand his world. The bequest to Jennifer, Patricia continued, includes the following conditions. The inheritance is contingent upon her continued employment with Lawson Consulting Solutions for a minimum of 2 years following the date of this will's execution, or until such time as the company is sold or dissolved. Now Jennifer looked genuinely confused. Conditions? What kind of conditions? And what do you mean, until the company is sold? Who would sell it? I'm reading the will as written, Jennifer. These are your father's words, not mine. A tension I hadn't noticed before began to creep into the room. Jennifer's confident posture shifted slightly, her hands unclenching and reclenching in her lap. I found myself leaning forward despite my intention to remain detached from these proceedings. Let me understand this clearly, Jennifer said, her voice taking on an edge I recognized from our confrontation at the chapel. I get the house and $500,000, but there are strings attached. And you're talking about the company being sold? That doesn't make sense. Dad would never sell the company. It was his life's work. Patricia removed her glasses and cleaned them carefully, a gesture that seemed designed to give everyone a moment to process what they'd heard. When she replaced them, her gaze moved between Jennifer and me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Your father's will contains additional provisions that address the disposition of his remaining assets, she said quietly. The company, his investment portfolio, and several other significant holdings. Well, then let's hear them, Jennifer demanded, her patience clearly wearing thin. What are these other provisions? I watched this exchange with growing unease. Something about Patricia's manner suggested that we were approaching territory none of us were prepared for. The careful way she was passing her words, the slightly apologetic tone creeping into her voice. It reminded me of the way doctors spoke when they had difficult news to deliver. Before I continue, Patricia said, settling back in her chair, I want to emphasize that these documents represent Mr. Lawson's final, considered wishes. They were prepared after extensive discussion and consultation, and he was adamant about their contents. The room fell silent except for the tick of an antique clock on Patricia's bookshelf. Jennifer stared at the lawyer with growing alarm, while I found myself wondering why Brian had insisted I be present for what seemed like a straightforward family matter. Patricia lifted the third page of the will, her eyes scanning the text briefly before looking up at both of us. However, she said, her voice carrying a weight that made my stomach tighten, there are additional provisions that fundamentally alter the distribution of Mr. Lawson's estate. Patricia lifted her reading glasses and looked directly at me for the first time since we'd entered her office. Something in her expression made my stomach tighten, a mixture of sympathy and professional obligation that suggested I was about to hear something I wasn't prepared for. However, she continued, her voice taking on additional weight, the will contains provisions for the disposition of Mr. Lawson's remaining assets, which constitute the majority of his estate. Jennifer leaned forward even further, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. Finally, let's hear about the company and the rest of his investments. Patricia returned her attention to the document, clearing her throat with the deliberate pause of someone about to deliver life-changing news. To my former wife, Linda Marie Patterson, she read, her words falling into the quiet office like stones into still water. I bequeath the sum of $33.5 million to be transferred from my primary investment accounts and securities portfolio. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. I felt my mouth fall open, a physical reaction I couldn't control. $33.5 million. The number was so large it didn't seem real. Didn't seem to apply to someone like me, sitting in a lawyer's office in Phoenix, Arizona. There must be some mistake, I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant. Did you say 33 million? 33.5 million, yes. Patricia's tone remained professionally neutral, but I caught something in her eyes. Not surprise, but the careful observation of someone watching expected chaos unfold. Jennifer's face had gone completely white, then flushed red, as if her blood couldn't decide which direction to flow. What did you just say? Additionally, Patricia continued reading, apparently determined to deliver the complete bombshell. I transfer to Linda Patterson controlling interest in Lawson Consulting Solutions, including all subsidiary companies, real estate holdings, and business assets. This transfer includes 65% ownership of all corporate entities and appointment as chairman of the board of directors. I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt sideways, as if the laws of physics had suddenly changed their minds about how the world should work. Controlling interest in Brian's company. The empire I'd watched him build from nothing. The business that had eventually consumed our marriage. The source of wealth that had made me feel so inadequate. He was giving it all to me. This can't be right. My voice came out as barely a whisper. There has to be some error in the documentation. I assure you, Mrs. Patterson, there is no error. Patricia removed her glasses again, cleaning them with methodical precision. These documents were prepared under Mr. Lawson's direct supervision. He reviewed every word multiple times and confirmed these were his exact wishes. Jennifer shot to her feet so abruptly her chair rolled backward and struck the wall. This is impossible. He couldn't. She turned to stare at me with an expression of pure disbelief mixed with something darker. What did you do? How did you manipulate him? I didn't do anything, I said weakly, still trying to process the impossibility of what I'd just heard. I haven't spoken to your father in 15 years. Liar. The word exploded from Jennifer like a gunshot. People don't just give away $33 million to their ex-wives for no reason. You must have gotten to him somehow. Convinced him when he was sick, when he wasn't thinking clearly. Patricia's voice cut through Jennifer's rising hysteria with professional authority. I can assure you that Mr. Lawson was of completely sound mind when he executed these documents. He underwent a thorough mental competency evaluation specifically to prevent any future challenges to the will's validity. I sat frozen in my chair, watching this scene unfold as if it were happening to someone else. The numbers Patricia had read, $33.5 million, controlling interest in a multi-million-dollar company, belonged in a different universe than the one where I worried about grocery bills and car repairs. But why? I asked, the question emerging from some deep place of confusion and disbelief. Why would he do this? Patricia gathered the will documents into a neat stack, her movements careful and deliberate. Mr. Lawson left specific instructions regarding that question, Mrs. Patterson. He asked me to share a personal message with you after reading these provisions. Jennifer's face contorted with rage and betrayal. A personal message? He left her a personal message but cut me out of everything that mattered. You received a substantial inheritance, Jennifer, Patricia replied calmly. $500,000 and a valuable property represent more wealth than most people see in their lifetimes. Compared to what she's getting, Jennifer pointed at me with a shaking finger. You're talking about hundreds of millions in total assets. The company alone is worth more than everything else combined. The room pulsed with tension so thick I could taste it. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I realized that my entire life had just changed in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. But all I could focus on was the impossible fact that Brian, stubborn, ambitious Brian, who had grown to resent everything I represented, had somehow decided to give me everything he'd built. That's when Jennifer completely lost control. This is fraud, she screamed, her voice cracking with rage. Criminal fraud. He was manipulated, coerced, mentally compromised. She whirled toward me, her face twisted with fury and disbelief. You did something to him. There's no other explanation. I shrank back in my chair, overwhelmed by the violence of her reaction. Jennifer, I swear to you, I had no contact with your father. I didn't even know he was sick. Liar. She slammed her palm against Patricia's desk, sending papers scattering. Nobody gives away everything they've built to someone who abandoned their family. Someone who couldn't even be bothered to call when he was dying. I didn't abandon anyone, I said quietly, finding some small reserve of strength. Our marriage ended, but that doesn't mean. It means exactly that. Jennifer's voice rose to a near shriek. You walked away from us. You took your pathetic settlement and disappeared into your pathetic little life while he built an empire. And now you want me to believe he just decided to hand it all over to you. Patricia's voice cut through the chaos with professional authority. Ms. Lawson, Jennifer, I understand this is difficult news, but I must insist you control yourself. These are your father's clearly stated wishes, executed with full legal authority. Jennifer spun toward the lawyer, her eyes blazing. I want every document examined. I want psychiatric evaluations. I want to know every single contact this woman had with my father in the past 5 years. There were no contacts, Patricia replied calmly. Mr. Lawson made that very clear when he explained his decision. Explained his decision. Jennifer's laugh was bitter and sharp. So he did explain why he decided to betray his only daughter and give everything to the woman who ruined his first marriage? He left a personal message for your mother, yes. The word mother seemed to hit Jennifer like a physical blow. For just a moment, her rage flickered, and something else showed through, a pain so deep it made my chest ache. Then the fury returned, doubled in intensity. She's not my mother, Jennifer snarled. My mother would have been there when he needed her. My mother would have supported his dreams instead of trying to drag him down. She turned back to me, her face contorted with years of accumulated resentment. You're nothing but a failed woman who couldn't handle being married to someone better than you. Each word landed like a knife thrust, not because they were entirely false, but because they contained enough truth to draw blood. I had felt inadequate during those final years. I had struggled with Brian's success. I had been the one who couldn't adapt to the world he was creating. Maybe you're right, I said quietly. Maybe I wasn't the wife he deserved. But I never asked for this. I never expected this. Expected. Jennifer's voice climbed another octave. You orchestrated this. Somehow, someway, you got to him when he was vulnerable, when he was sick or scared, or... That's enough, Patricia interrupted, her professional patience finally showing strain. Mr. Lawson was neither sick nor vulnerable when he made these decisions. He was, in fact, more determined and clear-minded than I'd ever seen him. Then why? Jennifer demanded, her voice breaking slightly. Why would he do this to me? I was everything he wanted me to be. I worked for his company. I lived the life he planned for me. I became the daughter he could be proud of. The pain in her voice cut through my own shock. Despite everything, the years of hostility, the public humiliation, the bitter accusations, I saw her clearly for a moment. A woman who had spent her entire adult life trying to earn her father's approval, only to discover he'd given his ultimate validation to someone else. He left a message explaining his reasoning, Patricia said gently. Would you like me to read it? Jennifer's hands were shaking now, her whole body vibrating with suppressed rage and grief. A message. He couldn't explain it to my face, but he left a message for her. The message addresses both of you, actually. It was meant to be shared after the will reading. I found my voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. Maybe we should hear what he had to say. Jennifer's eyes locked on mine with pure hatred. You have no right to make decisions here. You have no right to any of this. But even as she spoke, I could see the desperate need in her expression, the need to understand why her father had chosen to shatter everything she believed about her place in his world. Patricia was already reaching for another envelope, one with personal message written across it in Brian's familiar handwriting. Patricia raised her hand, commanding silence with the authority of someone accustomed to controlling emotional courtrooms. Enough, both of you. Her voice cut through the tension like a blade. Before this goes any further, I have something that will explain everything. She opened the manila envelope with Brian's distinctive handwriting across the front, extracting several pages of cream-colored stationery. Brian knew this moment would be difficult. He asked me to read this personal message after the will was announced. Jennifer slumped back into her chair, her rage momentarily displaced by desperate curiosity. I remained frozen, afraid to hope for understanding but desperate for any explanation that might make sense of this impossible situation. Patricia cleared her throat and began reading in Brian's own words. My dearest Linda, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably sitting in Patricia's office wondering if the entire world has lost its mind. I can picture your face, that expression you used to get when I'd rearranged the living room furniture without warning. Confused but trying to be polite about it. Despite everything, I felt my lips curve into the ghost of a smile. He'd captured that expression perfectly, and somehow hearing his voice through Patricia's reading made him feel present in the room. I know this inheritance comes as a shock. I know you're probably thinking there's been some terrible mistake, that you don't deserve this money or this responsibility. But Linda, you're wrong. You deserve every penny, and I'm going to tell you why. Patricia paused, glancing up at both of us before continuing. I never stopped loving you. Not during our worst fights. Not during the divorce proceedings. Not during these 15 years of stubborn silence. I was angry with you for not understanding my ambitions, but I was angrier with myself for choosing those ambitions over our marriage. You tried to save us, Linda. You begged me to find balance, to remember what mattered. I was too proud and too afraid to listen. The words hit me like physical blows. I felt tears starting, hot and unexpected, as decades of guilt and regret crystallized into this moment of impossible absolution. Jennifer, the message continued, and I saw my daughter's head snap up at hearing her name, my beautiful, brilliant girl. I know you're furious right now. Probably convinced your mother somehow manipulated me. But sweetheart, you're not ready for this inheritance. Not yet. Jennifer's face went white, then red, cycling through emotions too quickly to track. You've lived your entire adult life in the shadow of my success, accepting the benefits without understanding the responsibility. You've never had to build something from nothing, never had to make the hard choices that wealth requires. More importantly, you've spent 15 years hating a good woman for crimes she never committed. That's not true, Jennifer whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Patricia continued reading. Linda taught me about character, about integrity, about the kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself through cruelty or judgment. I forgot those lessons when I chose money over marriage, business over love. But I never forgot the woman who taught them to me. I was crying openly now, not caring how it looked. Brian's words were rebuilding something inside me that I thought was permanently broken. The sense that I had value, that my quiet life of dignity and service meant something. Jennifer, you have received enough to live comfortably and explore who you might become without the weight of unlimited wealth. Learn to build something yourself. Learn to value people over profit. Learn to forgive your mother for the crime of being human and imperfect. Jennifer made a sound like a wounded animal. Whether from rage or pain, I couldn't tell. Linda, you're inheriting more than money. You're inheriting the chance to do what I should have done, to use wealth as a tool for good rather than a weapon for proving superiority. I trust you because you never wanted this, because you'll never use it to hurt people the way I sometimes did. The message continued for several more paragraphs, outlining practical arrangements and expressing hopes for both our futures. But the core message was clear. Brian had chosen love over entitlement, character over expectation, wisdom over wealth. When Patricia finished reading, the office fell into profound silence. I sat with tears on my cheeks, overwhelmed by the gift of knowing that Brian had loved me until the end. Jennifer stared at the floor, her entire worldview crumbling around her. Finally, Patricia folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. He asked me to give this to you, Linda. The original is yours to keep. I reached for the letter with trembling hands, holding the last conversation I would ever have with the man who had shaped my life in ways both beautiful and painful. The weight of Brian's words settled over the office like dust after an explosion. For several minutes, none of us spoke. I held his letter against my chest, feeling the physical reality of his final gift. Not just the money, but the restoration of my worth in his eyes and, more importantly, in my own. Jennifer was the first to break the silence. "This isn't over," she said quietly, but the fire had gone out of her voice. "I can contest this. Mental incapacity, undue influence, fraud. There are ways to challenge a will." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since we'd entered Patricia's office. I saw a woman who had spent her entire life expecting the world to bend to her wishes, who had never learned that love couldn't be inherited or demanded, only earned. "You could try," I said gently. "But your father was right, Jennifer. You're not ready for this responsibility. And you are." Her laugh was bitter, hollow. "You're a nobody, Mom. A retired utility worker with no business experience, no connections, no understanding of what it takes to run a company worth hundreds of millions." For a moment, the old Linda, the one who had felt inadequate for 22 years, wanted to agree with her. But Brian's words echoed in my mind. "You deserve every penny." "Maybe you're right," I said, standing up slowly. "Maybe I don't know anything about running a business empire. But I know something your father valued more than business expertise." "What's that?" "I know the difference between serving others and serving myself." Jennifer's face twisted with a final flash of rage. "This is insane. He was sick. He was old. He wasn't thinking clearly." Patricia's voice cut through the outburst with professional finality. "Your father was 62 years old and in perfect mental health when he executed these documents. He underwent extensive psychological evaluation specifically to prevent the kind of challenges you're threatening." "Then why?" Jennifer's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Why would he do this to me?" I felt a surge of unexpected compassion for this angry woman who was, despite everything, still my daughter. "He didn't do it to you, Jennifer. He did it for you. He gave you a chance to discover who you are when you're not living in the shadow of unlimited wealth." "I don't want that chance." The words exploded from her with the force of 15 years of entitlement and expectation. "I want what's rightfully mine." "What's rightfully yours," I said quietly, "is $500,000 and a house worth nearly $1 million. That's more than most people see in a lifetime. What you think you deserved was never really yours to begin with." Jennifer stared at me for a long moment, and I saw her realize that something fundamental had changed. The woman she'd publicly humiliated that morning, the mother she'd dismissed as a failure, was no longer asking for her approval or understanding. "You think you've won," she said, gathering her coat with shaking hands. "You think this makes you some kind of hero." "No," I replied, and I felt the truth of it in my bones. "I think it makes me responsible." She stood at the office door for a moment, seeming smaller than when she'd entered. "This isn't finished." "Yes, it is," I said gently. "This finished the moment your father made his choice. The only question now is what you do with the life he's given you." She left without another word, the door closing behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. Patricia began organizing papers on her desk, the rustle of documents returning us to practical reality. "There will be paperwork to complete, accounts to transfer, board meetings to schedule. The company's current management team is excellent. They can help you transition into your new role." I nodded, still processing the magnitude of what had happened. "Patricia, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Did he really love me? Even after everything that went wrong between us?" She smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all day. "Linda, he talked about you every time we met. Not about the divorce, not about the problems. About the woman who taught him that success without character is just expensive failure." I walked out of that office a different woman than the one who had entered. The afternoon sun felt warmer, the air cleaner. I had work to do, responsibilities to embrace, a company to learn about and improve. But for the first time in 15 years, I felt worthy of the challenge. Justice, I realized, wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about recognition. The recognition that character matters more than credentials. That patience outlasts entitlement. And that love, real love, never truly dies. Brian had seen all of that, and in his final act, he had given me the chance to prove him right.